They trusted the green paint, the powerful engines, and the name that had been passed down from generation to generation. For farmers across America and around the world, John Deere wasn't just a brand, it was a lifeline. A symbol of reliability, tradition, and strength. But behind that legacy, behind the glossy brochures and billion-dollar marketing, lies a secret that has left countless farmers betrayed, trapped, and furious. Imagine buying a machine that costs as much as a house, only to discover that you don't really own it, that every repair, every adjustment, every update has to go through the company that sold it to you. Farmers have found themselves locked out of their own tractors, staring at screens that demand passwords only John Deere controls, forced to wait for authorized technicians who charge thousands of dollars just to press a few buttons. What started as whispers of frustration in small rural communities has grown into an international storm, with lawsuits, protests, and even governments stepping in to question how one company could seize so much power over the very people who feed the world. But here's the chilling part: this isn't just about tractors. It's about control over livelihoods, over harvests, over food itself. And once you see how deep this rabbit hole goes, you'll understand why farmers are calling it nothing short of a scam that shook the world. Because the truth is, John Deere didn't just sell machines, they sold promises of independence, of productivity, of hard work rewarded. Yet for many farmers, those promises have turned into shackles. Machines that once symbolized freedom in the fields have become digital prisons. And every time a farmer's tractor breaks down during harvest season, every hour lost waiting for an authorized technician, every dollar squeezed out of already razor-thin margins, the anger grows. But how did we get here? How did one of the most trusted names in farming turn its own customers into hostages of their own equipment? The answer lies in a system carefully built over decades, hidden behind contracts, software locks, and fine print that most farmers never imagined would one day rob them of their independence. It started quietly, almost invisibly, buried beneath the language of progress and innovation. When John Deere rolled out its new generation of tractors loaded with cutting-edge software, farmers were told it was a revolution: machines that could practically think for themselves, boosting yields, lowering costs, and making life easier on the farm. But tucked inside that promise was something few noticed at first. The tractors were no longer just mechanical beasts of steel and horsepower. They were computers on wheels, governed by code, encrypted, and locked tighter than a bank vault. At first, no one questioned it. Farmers were excited about GPS-guided rows, automated steering, and high-tech sensors that could detect soil quality in real time. But when the first breakdowns came, the cracks began to show. Suddenly, a farmer couldn't just grab his toolbox and fix the machine like his father or grandfather had done. A simple repair that once took an afternoon now required special software only John Deere had, and without it, the tractor might as well have been a 20-ton paperweight sitting in the field. What made matters worse was the timing. Farming doesn't wait. Crops don't pause their growth cycles because a tractor is down. Every day lost can mean tens of thousands of dollars gone forever. And yet, farmers had no choice but to wait for John Deere's authorized technicians, who often arrived days later, charged staggering fees, and sometimes performed nothing more than unlocking the system with a password. It was as if John Deere had sold the machines but kept the keys. Whispers started turning into outrage. Farmers began comparing stories at auctions, at supply stores, and across internet forums. A disturbing pattern emerged. John Deere wasn't just making it hard to fix their tractors, they were systematically eliminating the very idea of repair freedom. And as more farmers pieced it together, the feeling of betrayal deepened. This wasn't an accident. It was a business model. Behind closed doors, John Deere's legal teams had already built a fortress around this system. They argued that farmers didn't own the software running their tractors, they only licensed it, which meant that tampering with it, even to fix their own property, could be considered illegal. Imagine that, paying $500,000 for a machine, only to be told you don't have the right to repair it when it breaks. To farmers, it felt like theft hidden in plain sight. And this is where the story takes an even darker turn. Because when some farmers and independent mechanics tried to push back by finding workarounds, hacking the software, or using unofficial repair tools, John Deere fought back with lawsuits, cease and desist letters, and threats of crippling fines. It was no longer just about tractors. It was about power and who held it. Soon, What had once been a quiet murmur of discontent in rural America erupted into a full-blown movement. Farmers gathered at state capitals, holding signs that read, "We own our tractors and right to repair." Small-town meetings that once focused on crop yields and market prices now buzzed with talk of legal battles and corporate overreach. Independent repair shops, once the backbone of farming communities, were being strangled out of existence because they could no longer get the parts, tools, or codes needed to keep equipment running. The outrage wasn't confined to the United States. Around the world, from Canada to Australia, farmers faced the same problem: machines they couldn't repair, downtime they couldn't afford, and profits slipping through their fingers. Governments began to take notice. Lawmakers in multiple countries introduced right-to-repair bills, aiming to force companies like John Deere to make parts and software accessible. Even the European Union launched investigations into whether these practices were anti-competitive and abusive. What started as a battle between a few frustrated farmers and a corporate giant was quickly spiraling into an international showdown over who truly controls technology. But here's where the story gets even more staggering. While John Deere was telling farmers they couldn't fix their own machines, the company was quietly building a new empire behind the scenes, one fueled by data. Every time a tractor plowed a field or harvested a crop, it collected mountains of information: soil conditions, planting patterns, yield data, and more. Farmers began to realize this wasn't just about repairs, it was about ownership of their very livelihoods, because all that data, instead of belonging to the farmers who worked the land, was being funneled back to John Deere's servers. To the farmers, this felt like a second betrayal. Not only were they locked out of their tractors, but the knowledge that once belonged to generations of farming families, the intimate understanding of the land, the crops, the cycles of nature, was now being captured, packaged, and potentially sold to the highest bidder. Some began to suspect that John Deere wasn't just in the business of selling tractors anymore. They were in the business of controlling agriculture itself. And then came the lawsuits. Farmers banded together, accusing John Deere of monopolistic practices, arguing that the company's repair restrictions violated antitrust laws. Legal filings described farmers as hostages of their own machines. Reports surfaced of dealerships refusing to sell parts unless repairs were done through them. Every new revelation only fueled the fury, and the public began to ask the question: how did one of the most trusted brands in farming become the villain of the industry? Courtrooms across the country soon became the stage where decades of farmer frustration finally spilled out into the open. Testimonies painted a chilling picture: stories of harvests ruined because a tractor sat idle for days, waiting on a technician who charged thousands just to enter a code. One farmer described how a $30 sensor failure brought his $500,000 machine to a standstill, leaving him helpless as rain destroyed his crops. Another explained how he was forced to rent equipment at crippling costs, all because John Deere refused to release the diagnostic tools that could have fixed the problem in minutes. Judges listened as lawyers laid out how John Deere had crafted what amounted to a monopoly, not by building better machines, but by trapping farmers in a cycle of dependence. They pointed to contracts, software locks, and dealership exclusivity agreements as evidence of a carefully orchestrated strategy, one that gave John Deere control not just over repairs, but over the pace and profitability of farming itself. The courtroom gasps weren't just for dramatic effect. They reflected a growing realization that this was bigger than a corporate dispute. It was about survival. Meanwhile, investigative journalists dug even deeper, uncovering internal documents and whistleblower accounts that suggested John Deere knew exactly what it was doing. Reports indicated that company executives had openly discussed the revenue potential of repair restrictions, seeing service and software as untapped profit centers. For many, this confirmed the worst suspicions that the company had traded its legacy of trust and reliability for pure corporate greed. Farmers who once proudly wore John Deere hats now spoke of betrayal, saying the brand had abandoned its roots. In coffee shops and county fairs, the conversations were no longer about which tractor was the best, it was about how much longer farmers could hold out under the weight of John Deere's grip. And perhaps most alarming of all, whispers began to surface that other equipment manufacturers were watching closely, considering similar tactics. If John Deere could get away with it, what would stop the rest of the industry from following? The pressure was building. Lawsuits mounted, protests grew louder, and governments started drafting stricter legislation. Yet John Deere remained defiant, insisting its practices protected farmers from tampering and kept machines safe and efficient. But to those living the reality on the ground, this argument sounded like a cruel joke. Safety wasn't the issue. Control was done. As John Deere tightened its grip, farmers realized that waiting for the courts and lawmakers to act could mean financial ruin. So in barns, backyards, and dimly lit repair shops, a quiet rebellion began. Farmers and independent mechanics started sharing information, passing around USB drives, and trading whispers of hacked software that could unlock the machines. What once felt impossible, cracking the digital walls around John Deere's tractors, was now being fueled by desperation. Some of this underground knowledge came from unexpected places. Farmers discovered that in countries like Ukraine and Poland, resourceful mechanics had already broken through Deere's software to keep machines running without corporate permission. Smuggled tools and black market codes made their way across borders, spreading like wildfire through online forums and encrypted chat groups. Suddenly, the very farmers John Deere thought it had trapped were finding ways to fight back, taking risks that could cost them everything if caught. Stories spread of late-night repairs where farmers huddled around laptops, bypassing restrictions, just to bring their tractors back to life before dawn. These weren't hackers in the traditional sense. They were ordinary men and women who had no choice but to defy a corporation in order to save their harvests. Every successful repair felt like a victory, a reclaiming of independence, but it was also a dangerous game. John Deere's lawyers and investigators were relentless, sending cease and desist letters and threatening massive fines for anyone caught using unauthorized tools. The tension reached a boiling point. Farmers began to ask an unsettling question: what happens when technology designed to help them survive becomes a weapon used against them? If John Deere could lock them out of their tractors, what was stopping them from shutting machines down remotely, controlling when and how they were used? The thought alone was enough to send shivers through rural communities, and as governments debated laws and lawsuits dragged on, the underground repair networks only grew stronger, more organized. Farmers weren't just resisting anymore, they were building a parallel system of survival, one that openly challenged John Deere's monopoly. For the first time in decades, the image of the iconic green tractor was no longer a symbol of pride, but of corporate chains that farmers were learning how to break. The resistance that had started in dusty barns and quiet farm towns soon burst into the global spotlight. What was once dismissed as a niche farming issue was now front-page news. Major newspapers ran stories with headlines like "Farmers vs. John Deere, the right to repair war," and television networks aired interviews with exhausted farmers holding up broken tractor parts as symbols of their struggle. Suddenly, the plight of farmers wasn't just a rural concern, it was a global conversation about ownership, freedom, and corporate power. Tech experts began weighing in, drawing eerie parallels between John Deere's practices and those of companies like Apple, which also restricted who could repair their devices. The debate shifted: if farmers couldn't repair the very machines they needed to produce food, what did that mean for the future of food security? Politicians, sensing the growing outrage, started aligning themselves with the movement, promising reforms, holding hearings, and grilling John Deere executives under oath. The pressure was mounting, and the company could no longer hide behind glossy advertisements and decades of goodwill. But the farmers weren't waiting for politicians to save them. The underground repair networks had evolved into something bigger: grassroots movement powered by determination and technology. What began as a handful of shared USB drives turned into a global exchange of knowledge, with open-source repair guides, hacked software patches, and even entire online marketplaces dedicated to bypassing John Deere's locks. Farmers from Iowa were trading solutions with mechanics in Australia. Communities that once felt powerless against a billion-dollar corporation were now finding strength in solidarity, and the louder they got, the more uncomfortable questions surfaced. Was John Deere's real goal to sell tractors or to control the future of farming itself? If the company controlled the repairs, the data, and even the decisions about how machines could be used, did farmers truly own anything at all? Or had they unwittingly handed over their independence in exchange for technology that now held them hostage? The more the public learned, the more the anger spread. Documentaries were filmed, university professors published studies, activists rallied around the farmers, calling this one of the most blatant examples of corporate overreach in modern history. And John Deere, once untouchable, now found its reputation under siege. The walls began closing in on John Deere as the backlash reached the halls of power. In Washington, congressional hearings summoned Deere executives to explain why farmers, who had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for their machines, were treated like trespassers when they tried to repair them. Cameras captured the tense exchanges. Lawmakers demanding answers, farmers sitting in the gallery, arms crossed, eyes burning with years of frustration. One senator held up a copy of a John Deere software agreement and read aloud the fine print that declared farmers only licensed their tractors. Gasps rippled through the chamber. How could a farmer not own the machine he had mortgaged his land to buy? John Deere executives, polished and composed, insisted it was all for safety, for efficiency, for protecting the integrity of the technology. They argued that unauthorized repairs could cause accidents, damage crops, or even threaten the environment, but to the farmers listening, those words sounded hollow. They weren't safety concerns, they were excuses. And every excuse only deepened the anger, because these farmers weren't reckless. They were skilled mechanics who had fixed everything from engines to hydraulics for generations. They knew their machines better than anyone in a corporate office ever could. Meanwhile, lawsuits piled up. Courtrooms echoed with testimony after testimony, farmers describing ruined harvests, independent repair shops driven out of business, families forced to sell land because they couldn't keep up with costs. One particularly shocking case revealed that a farmer had lost his entire crop season because of a minor glitch in a tractor's onboard computer. The part itself cost less than $50, but because the repair required software access, he had to wait nearly 2 weeks for a Deere technician. By the time the machine was running again, the damage was irreversible. These stories, raw and emotional, began to sway public opinion. What once seemed like a technical debate about repair rights had transformed into a moral issue, one about fairness, survival, and the very soul of farming. Governments overseas joined the fight too. In Europe, regulators opened investigations into whether John Deere's practices violated antitrust laws. In Canada, farmer associations pushed their leaders to confront the company directly. Even in developing nations, where Deere was expanding aggressively, activists warned that allowing one corporation to control farming technology could devastate local food security. And yet, despite all the pressure, John Deere didn't fold. The company dug in its heels, lobbying politicians, funding think tanks, and launching PR campaigns to defend its model. Slick advertisements declared Deere was supporting farmers and building the future of agriculture. But behind the curtain, the resistance was growing stronger, more organized, and more determined to break free from the corporate grip. The turning point didn't come from boardrooms or glossy PR campaigns, it came from the ground up, from the very farmers Deere thought it had boxed in. A coalition of growers, independent mechanics, and digital rights activists began pooling their resources, forming alliances that stretched far beyond the fields. Tech-savvy hackers who had never set foot on a farm suddenly found themselves working side by side with corn growers from Iowa and wheat farmers from Kansas. Their shared mission was simple: crack the digital chains that John Deere had wrapped around the machines. Soon, their victories started making headlines. A group of hackers released leaked repair software, giving farmers tools Deere had kept locked away. Open-source communities began hosting repair manuals online, teaching anyone with the courage to try how to bypass restrictions. Deere fought back with lawsuits, calling the hacks illegal and dangerous, but the genie was out of the bottle. For every takedown notice, another mirror site popped up. For every lawsuit, another farmer stood up and said, enough, and then lawmakers, under mounting pressure, finally acted. Right-to-repair bills passed in several states, forcing Deere to make at least some repair tools available. At first glance, it seemed like a victory. Farmers cheered, headlines declared, "A win for the little guy." Deere even released a statement promising it would work alongside farmers to ensure fair access to repairs. But beneath the surface, cracks appeared. The tools Deere offered were limited, outdated, and carefully controlled. Farmers quickly discovered that many of the so-called solutions were little more than smoke and mirrors, designed to pacify the movement without giving away real power. That revelation ignited even more fury. Farmers felt tricked yet again, and what was supposed to be a concession only confirmed their suspicions. John Deere wasn't going to give up control willingly. In coffee shops, state fairs, and online forums, the talk shifted from fighting for repair rights to something far more radical. If Deere refused to change, maybe it was time to abandon the brand altogether. Independent startups began to gain attention. Small companies building open-source tractors that anyone could repair, upgrade, or modify without corporate permission. In places like Nebraska and South Dakota, a few brave farmers sold their Deere equipment altogether and switched to these alternative machines, sparking curiosity and hope in their communities. If these grassroots inventions could survive, they might not just threaten Deere's monopoly, they could rewrite the future of farming technology. And just as Deere tried to tighten its grip, it found itself facing a storm bigger than it had ever imagined. Not just lawsuits, not just protests, but an entire generation of farmers willing to tear down the green giant's empire. It meant reclaiming their freedom. Deere could feel the ground shifting beneath its wheels. What had once been an untouchable empire, a symbol of farming tradition and strength, was suddenly being challenged by small, scrappy competitors who promised something Deere no longer could: freedom. Open-source tractor startups, often built in humble workshops with limited budgets, began to attract global attention. Videos of these machines stripped of corporate locks, repairable with nothing more than a wrench and a bit of know-how, spread like wildfire across social media. Farmers marveled at the simplicity, the accessibility, the sheer honesty of the designs, but Deere wasn't about to sit idly by. Reports began to surface of heavy lobbying efforts aimed at slowing down right-to-repair momentum. Whispers circulated that Deere was reaching out to some of these small startups, offering buyouts or partnerships designed to swallow innovation before it could threaten their dominance. And when that failed, critics claimed Deere leaned on its immense influence to pressure regulators into scrutinizing competitors more harshly. It was the classic playbook of a giant corporation fighting to keep its throne, smother the threat before it grew too powerful.